Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Brad Rogers. I'm the Vice President of the Economic Society of Australia here in the ACT in Australia, and I've been quite lucky to catch Warwick McKibbin, one of Australia's best economists, to speak to us tonight about the economic and global macroeconomic scenarios that he's developed for the impacts of the coronavirus. First of all, I'd just like to let you know that we're going to take questions at the end, but there's a chat available throughout the talk, so please feel free to put in questions and I'll summarise them at the end. I just want to let you know about some of the Economic Society events that are coming up. That is on the 6th of August, the Women in Economics are holding the Improving Women's Financial Literacy. It's an online event, and you can see these events on our website. On the 13th of August, we're having our first in-person live event, which will be Professor Bob Breung and Professor Frank Giotto speaking about how can economic policy get us out of this coronavirus mess. So that'll be an interesting one as well. Now, I'll just give a little bit of an introduction about Warwick. I mean, most people know of his work, but he's the Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Centre of Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He's also Director of Policy Engagement and ANU Node Leader at the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research. He's an ANU Public Policy Fellow, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of School Sciences, a Distinguished Public Policy Fellow of the Economic Society of Australia, Distinguished Fellow of Asia and Pacific Policy Society, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, DC, and President of McKibbin Software Group. Of course, there's many more. He's also been a board member of the Reserve Bank of Australia and many other notable positions. I've seen Warwick speak quite a few times and I've always been impressed. And one particular event a few years ago, I remember he spoke to the Economic Society of Australia up in Queensland about the European Union and what was going on there. And I was really impressed with the way that he was able to break down the economic drivers and problems that were going to probably eventuate in the union breaking up quickly or gradually over time. And of course, we've seen that sort of effectively happening. And so he's been a great predictor. And then in 2003-4, he wrote about did the modelling and wrote about the globalisation disease, the case for SARS. And I picked up on that when I was working in the Department of Health in January, and I did a little paper on the early effects of coronavirus. And of course, I'm embarrassed today to how optimistic I was at that point. And then, so all those assumptions that we made then were very optimistic. And of course, Warwick had been doing papers for the Brookings Institute on the 2nd, 6th and 9th of March on the effects of the coronavirus. And now in June, he's done this update, the global macroeconomic scenarios of COVID-19 pandemic for the Centre of Applied Macroeconomic Analysis. We're still waiting on a few people, but I think we can probably get started. So feel free to have a drink. It's and don't. You can go ahead. Thanks, Warwick. Welcome. Thanks for speaking to the Society members.
Thanks very much, Brad. It's a great pleasure to be here. I like doing Economic Society presentations. I always get good questions. What I'll do is I'll share the screen now. Hopefully everyone can see this. Brad, will you confirm that you can see it, please?
Sorry, yes, yep, that looks fine. Thanks.
Okay, so this presentation, as Brad introduced it, is called the Global Macroeconomic Scenarios of the COVID-19 Pandemic. It's actually a joint paper with a PhD student of mine, McKibbin and Fernando, and it's available as a CAMA working paper. And we've innovated on this paper by producing a dashboard. And the dashboard is, you can go in there, and I'll actually use the dashboard in part of my presentation, so you can see the features of this dashboard. It lets you look at the impacts in different countries under different scenarios. And as I said, if you don't write down this link, it's okay. You just write down dashboard McKibbin COVID, and you'll find it pretty fast on any web browser. So as I said, this is joint work with Rochelle. What I'm going to do in the presentation is just touch quickly on what people are currently projecting from the major institutions, the IMF, World Bank, OECD. Talk about how we model the impact of COVID-19. We are using a global model, and so I'll just very briefly outline that model. Most of the people that hear me talk have heard me talk about this model before, so I'll go through any equations. It'll be purely a heuristic presentation. Then I'll talk about the epidemiological assumptions that are the building blocks of our scenarios, how we convert them into economic shocks, then talk through the results of the 6 different scenarios, show some of the dynamic stories, particularly for Australia. And there's some interesting issues about whether or not this is a permanent shock, the world will be different, or whether it's just going to be back to business as usual. I doubt that very much, but it's worth considering all the various options. So there have been, since we produced a paper in end of January, which we circulated to policymakers all over the world and then released it at the end of February. We didn't want to cause panic, but we thought it was useful to do the modelling. But since then, there's been a number of organisations that put out projections, and I'm not going to go through this table in detail, but if you look at, these are the countries that are in the model I'll be using, and this is just taking the various scenarios from the OECD, the IMF and the World Bank. And what you can see is these results are all a very deep recession. These are differences from the January 2020 projections from the IMF. This is the April report. There has been one about 2 weeks ago, much more pessimistic than this, much closer to our scenario 1, which I'll talk about shortly. Different types of recoveries. Most of the projections suggest that there'll be a V-shaped recovery, but again, international organisations are really constrained in what they can actually produce. So what do we do, which is in contrast to the IMF, the World Bank and the OECD? What we do is we take the approach that I developed with Zhonghua Li, which Brad mentioned. We developed it for the WHO on SARS in real time. They wanted to know how costly could the SARS pandemic be when it broke out. And then we extended it again when avian influenza broke out in 2006 with a PhD student at the time, Alexandra Sidorenko. She improved the technique substantially. And in the normal approach is you take the epidemiological scenarios. I'm not an epidemiologist, but we use the epidemiological information on virus infection rates, case mortality rates, how many people die who catch the disease. And importantly, from a labour supply point of view, the morbidity rates generally are much more important than the mortality. Morbidity is when people are sick, can't go to work, or people stay at home to care after people who don't go to work. So some people think a small number of people dying is not going to affect your economy. But if a large number of people are sick and they can't work, that is actually one of the key short-run shocks. And so the approach is to develop a set of shocks from the epidemiological, map them onto economic sectors and economies. And the way we did that in these other papers was to develop a whole range of indicators. So we're not just making it up, we're using information about a whole range of issues that I'll talk about, and then creating economic shocks, and then we're imposing policy responses. We take those shocks and those policy responses and put them in a global economic model. So what are the major shocks for modelling a pandemic? Well, as I mentioned, the reduction in the labour force, both because of death, which is a long-term shock, and morbidity, which is a short-term labour supply contraction. It changes the cost of doing business, and this is very different by sector, by country. In this pandemic, we've had a significant number of shutdowns in different countries. So these shutdowns actually physically close parts of the economic activity and have a very big impact on production change in countries and across countries. Importantly, people change their behaviour. So independent of what the government tells you to do, people are concerned, they change their consumer preferences. They don't go to restaurants, even if restaurants are open, they're less likely to go to restaurants. They change their spending. They also are likely to increase savings and reduce consumption independently of the prices and income effects from the shock. We also model the change in risk, both the sectoral risks that are being priced into equity markets and country risks, which we try and capture the international global adjustment in capital markets, which lead to very big movements potentially in exchange rates. And then we actually impose policy responses. Policy responses we observe or policy responses that we expect to observe. Now, in this paper, we're looking at 6 different scenarios, and the way we're slicing the scenarios are really based on how many waves of infection there are, and then how policymakers lock down their economy. So scenario 1, which is where we were when we wrote the paper in May the 20th, that seemed like a long time ago now, but that was assuming there was one wave. There were lockdowns where countries had lockdowns, but where countries didn't have lockdowns, then they didn't have lockdowns. So we could see how countries were responding. Some countries didn't actually have a complete wave yet. So we did some projections. We were estimating logistic functions to try and map, for example, Brazil, where the wave was still rising, to try and map Brazil into a realistic wave. And so for each country, we've predicted the first wave. It's given information on May 20th. Now, then we have the second, we assume that as with most influenza or most other pandemics, there will be a shadow wave in year 2. So in 2021, we assume that there'll be half the number of infections and the policy responses will be exactly the same, but just half as big. So the first case is quite optimistic. After 2021, we've killed the virus. The magic, we did the Donald Trump's, it'll go away or there's a vaccine. So that's a very optimistic scenario. Scenario 2 is where we have one wave. We have countries that do lockdowns, they continue to do lockdowns. Then in 2021, you get another wave, and then you get an exponential decline. So this virus never goes away. So we have a virus, it's big the first year, it's geometrically decaying the second year, the third year, the fourth year. But again, the policy responses in the subsequent years are the same, but smaller in proportion to the epidemiological shocks. The third case is where countries, as of May, decided that they better start opening in July, and they do it, and it turns out that's not a good idea. And so there's a second wave in the second half of 2020. Now, the reason we're using annual periods here is because it's an annual model. So we have to take a quarterly or a monthly type of shock and mold it into an annualized shock. So in the third scenario, there are 2 waves. So that, in other words, one annual wave, which is twice as big as what we saw by May. Again, where countries have lockdowns, they continue to do lockdowns. And then we have 2 more waves in the second year. So we've got this pandemic that's quite persistent for 4 waves. And again, the policy responses, countries keep doing exactly what they did before, but it's gone by 2021. Now, the 5th scenario is where there's a wave in each country, and then countries that did lockdowns have lockdowns. Countries that didn't do lockdowns didn't do lockdowns. But when the next wave comes in 2021, the lockdowns are no longer used. So we're pulling out the lockdown shock, but we're allowing the behaviour that we observe in the economy, the consumption shifts, the production shifts, the costs of doing business. We leave them in there. So we're trying to pick up the difference between how much of this is caused by the disease and how much of the economic damage is caused by the lockdown. Now, this is highly speculative, and I will be attacked from both sides, but you have to make some assumptions, and this is scenario analysis, not forecasting. And it's kind of interesting the way we work out how we develop the shock and try and unravel what was the lockdown and what was a behaviour. But this is a world in which the disease never goes away, and actually it changes people's perception of risk. So this is a world where risk is permanently higher. And then the final scenario is kind of an interesting case. It actually came about from someone commenting on our very first presentation. In scenario 6, we actually run 24 simulations. And for each country, we say, suppose the country we're focused on, let's say Australia, has a wave, and then and each country follows scenario 1. So Australia has scenario 1, and all the rest of the world follows scenario 4. So the rest of the world have 2 waves in the first year, 2 more waves in the second year, and it's exactly scenario 4. So the question there is, what if Australia gets it right and the rest of the world doesn't? Which seemed like a reasonable scenario to choose in May 20 or May 20 this year, but as it turns out, we are getting a pronounced reoccurrence, whether you call it a wave or a reoccurrence. So we do that country by country, and that gives you a sense of how much of your economic shock is coming from what you've done versus how much of your economic shock is coming from what the rest of the world is doing. Now, there's an infinite number of scenarios out there, obviously, and what we chose were the ones we thought were most informative for policymakers and most likely to occur in different ways in different countries. Now, before I continue, I just want to mention that the earlier paper, in case people are thinking this is just an extension, this is a very different paper. The paper we brought out in February, we looked at 7 scenarios. We didn't know this was going to be a pandemic. We basically said, if you use the history of pandemics, the Asian flu, the Hong Kong flu, and the Spanish flu, and you map the epidemiological outcomes, which are very large loss of life when you apply the percentages to today's population, how does it propagate through the world? And that paper was published very early on in the real-time papers at CPR. So in that case, we used a methodology where we were modelling both the pandemic, the epidemiological transmission, as well as the economic adjustment. So we had the Chinese data, so we knew the infection rates in China, we knew the mortality rates in China, and the morbidity rates, subject to the knowledge that Chinese data is not always accurate, nor is a lot of countries' data. But we knew that, so we said, okay, suppose we knew that. Suppose we have all these indicators of people's relative vulnerability to the Chinese shock through tourism, through location relative to China, and adjusted the epidemiological outcomes based on indexes of quality of healthcare systems, etc. So we use these indexes to create a global pandemic. So those numbers were purely speculative. What does it look like previous pandemics? Now, some people have attacked this work and said, well, they were wrong because it didn't get the outcomes we observed in that paper. Well, the point is, we weren't predicting, we were saying, if you don't do anything, this is what's likely to happen. And some countries like Australia did something. So of course we don't get the same epidemiological outcomes. So in this paper then, the difference is that we now have the data. So now with this new paper, we're not modelling the way the pandemic moves across countries. We're taking the data as we see it in different countries as of the 20th of May. So we're not doing any of the epidemiological historical analysis. And we're not modelling any of the transmission across countries. So that's just to clarify the difference between these 2 papers. Very different papers. This is more realistic in the sense that we're now looking at the current pandemic. So if you want to criticise our earlier paper because it was a counterfactual, you can never say we were wrong because we never saw that counterfactual. It was what if history repeats itself. As it turns out, for some countries, history is repeating itself. If you look at Brazil, the US, and a few other countries, because they ignore the epidemiological warnings. So what's the model we're using? Well, you cannot do this sort of global analysis, I don't think, without an economic model. So this is the model. It's the GQ model. It's in the handbook of CGE modelling, and it's widely used around the world. It's well documented. People can pull it apart, put it back together. It's used by the IMF, World Bank, researchers, central banks around the world. And the way to think of this model, it's a hybrid of a DSGE model, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models we see at central banks, which are very small, and a CGE model, computable general equilibrium model, which actually is generally quite large and have lots of sectors. So what we've tried to do is have a macro model with lots of sectors. We captured inter-industry linkages through trade, capital flows, intertemporal models of consumption and investment. So it has a lot more strengths relative to CGE models, which tend to have very simple consumption and investment savings behaviour. It's an annual model, and the dynamics generated at the sectoral and at the aggregate level. The model has lots of frictions. We have unemployment, we have stickiness in capital accumulation, we have full employment in the long run, and we have mobility of labour within countries, but not across countries. It's a very straightforward CGE type framework. Firms are maximising value, but they're maximising the value based on intertemporal decisions. Households maximise expected utility based on wealth and liquidity constraints. We have some agents who are rational, some agents that are non-rational. We have wage rigidity different in different countries, which picks up short-run unemployment impacts. We have financial markets, which distinguishes this from CGE type models because we have markets for bonds, equity, foreign exchange. And we have international trade in goods, services, and financial assets, which in a pandemic is a key mechanism for propagating the economic shock. Very importantly, we have fiscal rules for each government, and we have a monetary rule, the Henderson, McKibbin, Taylor type rule, where we try and mimic the behaviour of different central banks in different countries, whether they're flexible inflation targeters or fixed exchange rate targeters, etc. So summary key features, intertemporal optimization. So households and firms are forward-looking. So what they expect about a pandemic is really important for the results. There's a lot of econometrics in the estimation of the elasticities of substitution in demand, in consumption and in production. I'll talk a little bit about the catch-up model because it matters briefly. But the big difference here to keep in mind is we have a difference between financial and physical capital. Financial capital is arbitraged across sectors and across countries instantly, but physical capital, once it's in place, is very hard to move. So in the long run, you have arbitrage between physical capital and financial assets, but in the short run, that's restricted by the adjustment costs in the production side of the economy. So what's the model? Well, we call it the G-Cube G20 model. It's a model of the G20. We have the 20 countries in the G20, or the 19 actually, down the left, and then 4 regions. So it's an entire global system, 6 sectors of production: energy, mining, agriculture, 2 types of manufacturing and services. And then, as I said, we have households, we have firms, and we have governments, and we have central banks. And a full copy of this is online in McKibbin and Triggs 2019. So how do we do this? Right, so we solve the model. We have to generate what's called a baseline. So we solve the model from 2016 to 2100. And to do that, you have to make exogenous assumptions about population growth and labour force growth by country, productivity growth by sector, by country, what's happening to technology over the next 90 years. It's a brave call, but someone has to do it. And we have to make decisions about policy rules, etc. So the idea is, first, we have a world without a pandemic. And the baseline is really quite important, and it's quite interesting. The way we do this is we have the Groningen database, which tells us what sectoral productivity is for a group of countries. So we know the difference between the frontier country, which is the US, and all other countries in the database. And so once we know the gap in technology or productivity, we then have this model which generates the rate of a level of technology of productivity at each point in time based on catching up to the frontier, closing the gap at the sectoral level by 2% a year. And we use 1.4% for the US frontier, and then the Barrow catch-up rate, which is closing that gap at 2% a year, to generate the growth in the economy. But we vary it by countries. So for example, if a country's got economic reforms in place like China, we can have faster catch-up, or if they've got institutional rigidities like Russia, much slower catch-up. So we can actually have time-varying catch-up. This is to try and get a realistic projection of where the world would be between now and 2100. And then once you feed this in, we know what the labour force, long-term labour force looks like, because it comes from the UN. We know the productivity assumptions from the catch-up model, and then the model generates endogenous investment and a growth rate at the sector on a national level. So we're going to take this then, and we're going to say, oh, 2020, there's a surprise. Agents know once the shock hits what's going to happen. So under each one of these scenarios, 30% of firms and households know the way the pandemic is going to pan out. But each pandemic assumption is different, so each scenario has a different set of assumptions. And again, remember that most of the people are actually using rule of thumb rather than having rational expectations. So how do we create the shocks? So we've got actual case infection rates and case mortality rates as of 20th of May. We then fit logistic curves for each country, and then we assume that they flatten the curve as did similar countries over the same number of periods from the first case. Now, I'm going to do the presentation now from the dashboard. This is a highly risky strategy, and if it doesn't work, I have a backup. But let me just see if this works. Brad, would you tell me if you don't see that? Sorry, there we go. Is that screen being shared?
I can't see.
You can't see it. So I'm going to change. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share a different screen. And now you should see the right screen. Is that correct?
Yep, the ANU website screen.
There we go.
Yep.
So
There
this
we
is
go.
the dashboard which you can actually log in, go in, and this tells you all the information you need about how we constructed the scenarios, what the shocks look like, what's the impact on all the countries in the model. So what I'm going to do is go into the epidemiological assumptions first and just show you some examples. So these are the curves that we fitted for the different countries. Australia, we didn't really need to fit the curve. This is the number of infections. So this is cumulative cases from an initial point. So we do this for all countries. And then we work out how to create the shocks. Now this is mind-boggling and I haven't got enough time, but let's give you an indication. So this is what we do. This is how we change the labour force. This is a labour supply shock. So we have the cases for all the countries. We can extrapolate statistically what the wave looks like. We know that the disease impacts different ages in different ways. So we actually take into account the age distribution of the labour force. So countries that have got a very old population, they're going to have more infections than a country that's got less population. So we've got the specific case fatality rates, and then we can scale these by the different scenarios. So if the second wave is twice as big as the first wave, then all this labour supply shock will be twice as big. We also try to adjust for the fact that a lot of carers in the labour force would tend to be women. So we have data on the female participation rates, and we can adjust the morbidity shocks to take more women out of the labour force as a result of the various different shocks. So we've got all this information on incubation period, how long does the disease last, and we can scale the infection rates, and then we come up with morbidity rates, mortality rates, and that gives us a shock to the labour force by country. So this is quite complex, and you could argue with specific numbers, obviously. The second shock is how consumers shift their preferences. So we know, because we only have 6 sectors of production, but we have the GTAP database, which has 57 sectors. So we can go into the GTAP database and at the very disaggregated sectoral work out how much of each sector would be affected by a pandemic. What we have is, we have data on the nature of the consumption bundles within each of the sectors. So we can then adjust for sectors, for example, a service sector which has a lot of restaurants or a lot of social interaction activities, that's going to have a much bigger shock. So we can actually get a lot of information on how much the sector, so let me back up. We know we have electricity data, high frequency electricity data. So we know how much of each sector was using electricity, how much electricity demand changed in each sector. Now that comes from both a demand and supply shock. We know from the ABS what sectors were shut down. So we know how much of a sector was shut down. We know how much electricity moved in that sector. So the difference has to be consumers that were changing their preferences. And then we use that as a shock for preferences. So we use this Ausgrid data, we use the ABS data, we back out what must have been a preference shift from what was a shutdown mandated government policy action. And then we scale these by the shocks. The second shock in consumption isn't a shift in bundles, it's actually changing the discount rate on future income. So that in fact, if the discount rate goes up, people feel more risky, then they're going to increase their savings and cut their aggregate consumption, independently of the model-generated consumption changes. So we've got some indexes on what happened in equity markets in the US, volatility change, how much volatility went up. We have an index of risk aversion, and we can actually feed that in to calculate a shock to the discount rate of households. And then we scale that by how long the shutdowns last. So two shutdowns has a higher risk, twice the size risk premium than one shutdown. So that gives us those two sets of shocks on consumption. Then we have the productivity shock. So the way to think about the productivity shock is the productivity reduction is equivalent to an increase in costs. So for a company that now has to put in the social distancing in the store, has to put in a whole bunch of prevention devices, has to incur additional costs of production, it's equivalent to being less productive for the same amount of inputs. So we know what sectors were shut down. So we know we can adjust the productivity by the information from shutdown, and we have the Ausgrid data as well on how much electricity demand fell in different sectors at the very deep level, which we can aggregate up because each country has a different sectoral composition. And then we also want to shock the risk premia in the equity markets. So we have, we only had data on Australia actually. So we looked at what sectors were impacted in the ASX. We could then map that onto the different sectoral compositions in other countries. So we didn't have complete data, but that's what gave us the equity shock. Then we have the country risk. So this again was trying to pick up the fact that some people would just pull their money out of countries that would be badly affected. And we had information, this was from the exposure data that we used previously. We know how much health expenditure there is per capita. We have a global health security index. There's an international country risk index that people produce. We know how big the current account balances are. So we assume that countries with big current account deficits tend to be more risky. And we know the death rates, and we can create these indexes of health risk, governance risk, financial risk, and demonstrated vulnerability to the pandemic. And then we can scale that according to the number of shutdowns and the number of waves. And then we can combine that with information we have on what happened to the US market when the shock hit, and that gives us a country risk premium shock. So this is all relative to the US. Okay, so I better keep moving. So we've got, there were very different policy responses. So one of the key differences looking across the fiscal space was there were spending changes by government, there were wage subsidies by government, and there were transfer payments by government. And so we tried to break the fiscal responses into those three broad categories. We have the stimulus packages from various countries. We have the wage subsidy. It's a bit tricky because we don't know how many people in each sector took up the wage subsidy. So we try and use Treasury forecasts for the cost of the wage subsidy and the impact on employment, and back out what the actual wage subsidy would be effectively in each sector. And then we know the transfers from the IMF database. Okay, so this is quite complex putting together these shocks, and you can actually see the shocks and highly sensitive to the different assumptions. But it's useful to if you want to know how deeply we went into this was a lot of work to generate these shocks. Now, what happens in these results, and I'll get to the results now. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a number of infections for each scenario. So scenario one, take Australia. We have a wave. We had 7,397 in year one. Then we have the shadow wave in year two. In scenario two, we have the wave. We have the shadow wave. Scenario three, we have two waves in the first period. Scenario four, we have two waves, and then we have an additional change in shutdowns. And then in the scenario five, this is the case where we get the first wave in the first half of the year, and that has shutdowns. In the second half of the year, no shutdowns. So because there's no shutdowns, we end up with we get a bigger infection rate because we didn't prevent the spread of the virus. And so in year two, you get, again, the virus is now starting to dissipate, but we still, because there's no shutdown, there's no social distancing, there's no government prevention, you get a much bigger number of cases. And so if you look at these scenarios now, take the United States, this was very optimistic. We've gone well past to 1.6 million. We're getting well past 4 million. So we're getting out here into scenario 5 territory. So each country has done different things. This was just mapping what we knew in May 20th onto this epidemiological model. Okay, so that's the number of infections, this number of deaths. And again, if we got it right the first time, it would have been around 104. That's where it was leveling off before the outbreaks in Melbourne. You can see that if you go to scenario 5, where basically no more lockdowns, it's already out, it's too late, let's just let it rip. You get 363 in deaths in scenario 5. You start looking at the world numbers, you're getting close to 1.4 million deaths. Again, this is very sensitive to the treatment regime, and it could well be, and it probably is the case that treatments will get much better. There's a lot of the treatments now are preventing more deaths than when the disease broke out. So again, this is fairly speculative, but it's a conditional framework on which we overlay the economic analysis. Now, this is what happens in the world under the different scenarios. This is GDP relative to what it would have been. So be very careful. This is not the growth rate, and it's certainly not the change in GDP from 2019 to 2020. So this is the percentage difference between what would have been in 2020 compared to what is. So if you look at Australia in scenario one, if Australia was going to have a growth rate in 2020 of 2.57%, so it would have been 2.57% higher, then this says you subtract off 8.57 from 2.57 and you end up with -6. So the growth rate will be 6%, will be -6% in 2020. So these numbers look bigger than some people interpret them, but this is a 6% slowdown. That's a recession in Australia. And you can see that as you get more, if Australia gets it right and the world gets it wrong, you compare scenario 6, 9.32, to scenario 1 would have grown at, say, 3%. So that's a growth rate of -9%.
Just having a bit of a connection problem there, Warwick. I'm not sure if you can hear us. You're sort of dropping out there.
The growth rate is
Oops. Sorry, I think you've dropped out altogether, Warwick. You there? Yep.
substantial.
Sorry, looks like I've had a bit of a failure with the connection. Hopefully Warwick will log back in a second. People feel free to put up your questions in the chat box there. And I'll get to those at the end of the talk.
I think I'll go to, yeah, okay. Can you see that screen?
Yes, yep.
Okay, okay, so let me just, what's it doing? Oh, back in here, okay. Not sure what screen I'm, I'll just have to stop sharing for a second. Okay, so this should be, you should back have the GDP back on the screen. Okay, can you hear me at all?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So this is what happens to employment. And you can see the employment numbers are a lot bigger than the employment changes, than the GDP changes for many countries. So you can see for Australia, for example, we get a labour, this is hours worked. So hours worked in 2020 are 6% lower than they would have been. So that means that the unemployment rate, if it was going to be around 5%, then this means unemployment is 11%. And just like the GDP numbers, as you get more waves and more shutdowns, you get more and more unemployment. And you can see that the difference again between you getting it right and the rest of the world getting it wrong is still 1.5%. When you start to look at the US down the bottom here, you can see that the US numbers are really quite astonishing, 14%. So this has been an unemployment rate of 11%. So we've got very large increases. This is Great Depression or worse once you start getting the shutdowns and the wave, four waves, 4 shutdowns. You can see that if you didn't do the shutdowns and you just let it wash through the economy, there is an economic benefit, but it's very small compared to the actual shock itself. So I'm going to run out of time here. This is the fiscal deficits. What's interesting is this shock inflationary or deflationary? Well, it depends. It's a collapse of supply, it's a collapse of demand. If supply falls more than demand, inflation will go up. If demand falls more than supply, you have deflation. And you can see it's very different across countries. And you can see it also changes across scenarios. So the first scenario is mildly inflationary for Australia. The second scenario is mildly deflationary for Australia. Real interest rates plummet in the first year in these scenarios. And as we've seen, central banks have gone to 0 interest rates in most countries, and real interest rates have really fallen a long way. What are the dynamics? So these are the results for Australia. This is a snapshot. So this chart shows you the percent deviation from what otherwise would be the case. The first chart up here is change in real GDP, and we've got it across the 6 scenarios. So we can see is this is a GDP loss of between 8% for scenario 6, which is where Australia gets it right and the rest of the world gets it wrong, down to scenario 4, which is 12%. So if we get into scenario 4, which is effectively 2 waves this year, 2 waves next year, then we've got a very, very deep recession. If you don't do the economic shutdowns, which is we've done it in the first wave, but not the next 3, then you end up with something less of a decline. But scenario 5 again is the case where the shock never goes away. So scenario 5 is where people's risk perceptions are permanently shifted, and you can see there are long-term consequences of that. By period 6, which is 2026, you'll have permanently lower output relative to what it would have been. So this is a case where you don't go back to where you were, and this is because of a permanent shift in risk. You can see that most clearly in investment. Clearly, if the world is more risky, there'll be less investment. Less investment, less capital, less production capacity. And you can see again, the trade balance. The trade balance here is driven purely by savings and investment outcomes. So the fact that Australia's trade balance deteriorates means that there's probably more investment in Australia than there is savings, which means that we have capital flowing into the country, and under the different scenarios, the trade balance moves between -6% of GDP and 3% of GDP. You can see the employment story again is varying across the different scenarios as you'd expect. The scenario 5, eventually employment will go back to where it was, but that will entail a very large fall in real wages because that's what drives you back to full employment. And again, you can see you get deflation or inflation depending on the scenario, and it varies over time. Notice that the central bank always wins. So eventually the central bank gets the inflation rate that they want. Now, what happens at the sectoral level? The sectoral level is kind of interesting because this is what happens initially in energy. We end up getting a spike up in energy demand in Australia, but we basically get output in every other sector contracting. So you've got mining, agriculture, durable manufacturing, non-durable manufacturing, and services. What's kind of interesting here is just how much the assumption about the future persistence of the shock mean? So sectors that produce capital goods that go into investment, if the world is permanently on a lower level of output, then sectors like mining have a very large contraction relative to where they would otherwise have been. And of course, durable manufacturing is largely the capital producing sector. So you can see this change in expectations, this change in risk leads to a permanent decline in the durable manufacturing sector and also into some of the other sectors that feed into that. What happens to employment? Well, all the sectors get hit with the employment shock. And you can see, interestingly, if Australia gets it right and the rest of the world gets it wrong, that means the demand for our exports are going to be a lot weaker, which means those sectors which are export intensive are going to lose jobs. And you can see particularly energy takes a big hit. We export a lot of energy in the form of, we export a lot of energy, oil, gas, mainly gas. And you can see again, the mining sector gets hit more, the agricultural sector gets hit more. So it really does matter what's happening in the rest of the world as well as what we're doing domestically. So let me sum up. There's still a little bit of time left. I think that we recovered. I don't know what happened. We don't know very much about how the world is going to evolve from this point, and we certainly don't know how each country is going to respond. The uncertainty, though, is you need to do some modelling of scenarios to really grapple with how much should governments be intervening at this point to stop the spread of the pandemic. The scenarios all have very high economic costs, and they're quite persistent. The worst case is where there's no vaccine. Countries have just given up trying to do any social distancing, any responsible interventions, and the economic costs in that case are very, very large. How countries respond is really a critical time right now. David Vines and I just published a paper, it's a working paper in CAMA. It's coming out in Oxford Review of Economic Policy any day. But we look at, in that paper, we look at, suppose the world is in scenario 5. What can we do about it from a G20 or an IMF point of view? And it's really, there's nothing that monetary policy can actually do except prevent a financial crisis. Fiscal policy, if we spent another $3 trillion globally, we need to transfer a lot of resources into countries that can't do fiscal stimulus because they're either constrained by institutional arrangements such as Italy inside the Eurozone, although in recent days the European Union has come up with a solution for issuing debt at the European level, which enables Italy to borrow more than otherwise would be the case. But other countries such as Brazil and Argentina, they face the original sin problem. They can't borrow, their debt is all in foreign currency, they can't do fiscal stimulus, and they're not doing fiscal stimulus for that very reason. So there's a role for the G20 to facilitate the transfer of resources into these economies. If you do that, we find a significant improvement in the global economy for those countries, but also for the countries that are currently doing fiscal stimulus. So the spillovers from a global response through the G20 or through the IMF are actually quite significantly positive for everybody. And that really is dealing with the demand side shock. We need to keep demand strong, we need income flowing, and then we have to deal with the supply side shock over time through various reforms. So it is a short-term demand issue and supply issue, but in the longer term, it's really generating more productivity growth in the global economy. And the bottom line at the end of the day is, once you see what's happened now, as we know, as we knew from the previous pandemics, as we knew from SARS, there's an enormous case for prevention, for investing in public health systems in poor countries, in emerging economies, in the countries that don't have enough public health capacity to deal with the virus outbreak when they occur. That is so much cheaper than the $10 to $12 trillion that we're currently spending in the world to try and battle a pandemic that's already been released. And so we knew this was coming. We knew how to solve it. As we know how to deal with the current raging pandemic, there is experts who have very clear bases for their recommendations. But for some reason, people and politicians don't always do the right thing. And I shall stop there. There's some references and there's information on G-Cubed at the website, gcubed.com. So happy to take questions. Apologies for disappearing.
Geez. Thanks very much, Warwick. Really impressive. Thanks for walking us through your model. And yeah, so I shudder to think how difficult it would be in a country that doesn't have a really strong health system and the economy that can support this, and what sort of impacts it's having on them. And it'd be great to see the G20 do something to help. I've got quite a few questions. I'm not sure if you can see, Warwick,
Yeah,
if you can see the Q&A.
I can see the Q&A. Do you want me to run through them as...
Yeah, sorry, because I don't want to read them all out. It'd be
okay, so Tim Walshaw has a question about the R factor. We're not actually, what we're doing is fitting curves. So we're saying for those countries where we had the infection curve, we didn't have to fit anything. For those countries where we didn't have it, we fitted the curve based on where they countries were on that curve and similar countries that have been through the curve. So we weren't doing detailed epidemiological modelling at all. We were just fitting those curves on infection rates and then mapping the infection rates and the case fatality rates based on data as of May 2020. And you're right to point out the case fatality rates do vary over time. They depend on treatment. They depend on the age distribution. We do adjust for the age distribution across countries in the analysis, but it's very crude epidemiological modelling, and I apologise to any epidemiologists that are out there.
Just on that point, Warwick, I was going to ask, I had heard that the early numbers were a bit skewed because they're only measuring fatality rates of people who turned up to hospitals to get tested, and so the numbers of people being tested was very small, and the percentage of people passing away was, would be high relative to the broader real thing. But I assume
again,
people have dealt with that.
There's enormous uncertainty about what the case fatality rates are. There's a whole issue about how many of the population are actually asymptomatic and therefore are infected but don't even show symptoms, so therefore they get counted as being infected. So you could argue that this is anything from a common flu all the way up to Ebola. I mean, that's the uncertainty range. So the question is, do you just assume it away, or do you take the data you have at the time we have it? And so we just decided we would take the official estimates. Clearly, there's some bias in both directions. We just don't know enough about the disease to be precise, and we're not being precise. We're asking what if questions. What if this is the case fatality rate? What if this is the case mortality rate? Sorry, the case morbidity rate? And what does it mean in terms of economics based on what we've observed? And there are a lot of people who argue that this is a basic influenza. Well, I think if you lived in Florida or New York or Italy, you'd be very concerned with the policy that was based on that assumption, because who knows until it's over. But again, my view is you pick the policy that's going to cause the least damage. So if I'm right and we go ahead and spend this money and it turned out it wasn't going to end up being many people died, okay, that's one outcome. But what if it turns out that this really is a long-term life quality issue, that people who recover actually have very serious long-term effects? What if the economic damage that does lasts forever? Then not doing something and having the Spanish flu is far, far worse. And so to me, given the uncertainty, and anyone who says they know what's going on, so confident, if you read Twitter, so many confident people who are not experts, but have probability 1 answers, that's dangerous from a policy point of view. So I believe in managing the risk. If the pandemic gets out of control, then you probably are better off not closing down sectors of the economy just because it's already too late. But when you have the opportunity like we did and like other countries did, then I think there's a pretty clear answer from these simulations that it's worth trying, because letting it rip can be very expensive. Now I've got another question. Jordan asks, what's the most surprising, is a compliment there, but I won't read that out. What's the most surprising result to you from the results presented across all scenarios, and the scenarios that you think is most likely to eventuate? I guess the one thing which I hadn't actually thought about until I saw the results was just how much the different types of pandemic outcomes, even though the aggregate effects might look very similar, once you have a persistent pandemic, it really hurts those sectors that produce the capital goods. And so we see a big hit on durable manufacturing, we see a big hit on mining, we see a big hit on energy. So it's, once you see the results, you say, of course, that's obvious. That's because of how these sectors interact in the economy. Well, I thought we were in scenario 6 when I wrote the paper. That is, Australia got it right and everyone else got it wrong. I now think we're probably in scenario 3. The US is probably in scenario 5. Different countries are in different places, but this is nowhere near finished. So again, I got a lot of emails and attacks in the media about being wrong. Well, it's only July, okay? Our analysis said in the first year. So let's just wait and see after the first year, just what we get. I think the countries that have done the best are the ones that actually took the epidemiology seriously. Okay, Richard, there's some good questions coming. Okay, I can see that there's a lag in the statistics which give the speed of the infection seem to make it difficult to make a prediction of the infection on the economy. Well, again, we're in an annual frequency here, and what we had was real data. So the electricity data was really interesting. It was provided confidentially, so we couldn't release it. But basically, it told us in real time what was happening in different parts of the economy. And so it wasn't that we were making up the epidemiological shocks having an economic impact. We were measuring in a short period, admittedly, what was happening to the cases and the fatalities and what was happening in the economy. So we were able to put those bits of information together, and of course you could change assumptions and you'll get slightly different results, which is why we did a whole range of different scenarios. Wait and see. I think what we've seen in terms of the relationship between the infections, the deaths, and the economic activity, the model has done a reasonable job up until now. Did you want to, Brad, did you want to respond to that, or? Okay, so Evanston Tan asked the question, what do you think of the economic implications of suppression versus elimination? That's a good question, right? I was on the Group of 8 committee that wrote the report on the road to recovery. And in that process, everyone was anonymous, but in that process, I chose the suppression rather than elimination strategy. In the end, they're very, very similar. They're very, very similar. I just don't think you can eliminate to the point where there are no cases, but you can suppress to the point where there are very few cases. And there's always going to be few cases because we're always going to have people coming back in to Australia. We're going to have transmission through a whole range of different processes, legal and illegal. And so the idea was to put in place, the key thing is testing, tracing, and isolating. Now you can do that at various levels. You can do it once you get an R0 above 2, or you can do it at a much lower, or above 1, or you can do it at a much lower level. My view is that that's the way to do it, and it would have worked if we didn't have mistakes and dishonesty. The mistakes in Melbourne, we'll find out why would you have people in looking after quarantine hotels that didn't know what they were doing. Let's wait and see on that one, but that's the key. Both of these approaches require those 3 things to work: testing, tracing, isolating. If you don't have them in place, then it's going to run rampant. Oh yeah, Azadeh Abbasi asks, can we provide scenario updates? Yeah, so Roshan, my co-author, was proposing to update the dashboard every 2 to 4 weeks. So we will be doing updates on the dashboard, but obviously not putting out new papers because we've got time. Okay, there's a couple of. Okay, what's the chance? So Stephen asks, what's the chance the productivity shock will be reversed out of the recovery phase due to poor performing firms having failed and high performing surviving? This is actually a really good question because in January, I published a paper with Adam Triggs about singularity. And that was looking at a range of scenarios from a global productivity collapse to a productivity boom where innovation created technology, created innovation, created technology. And singularity is a totally different world. We have massive booms. Now, you could make the case that it's not the creative destruction of badly performing firms, because I think too many firms will be saved that should have been gone once they became zombies. And that's going to be the challenge for policy. That's what happened after the Great Recession. And that's probably why global productivity was so weak for the next decade. but actually the take-up of technology, the way we're doing this seminar, apart from the glitch, there's a lot of potential productivity coming out of this boom, which could very quickly turn things around in the next year or two. So I think you can be optimistic that there's a lot of new ways of doing things that have been adopted. What was the puzzle before was there was so much technology, no one was seemingly using it. Now we're seeing it being used in very productive ways. So it could well be that the other side of this is a boom. One hopes that's the case, because the only way you can deal with the amount of government debt that's being produced in the response necessarily, the only way you can deal with that is if you can end up with a very high growth rate in the economy, so that your nominal growth outruns the nominal interest rate. And that'll be very tricky for policymakers. You want to be in the country that has the productivity growth. You don't want to be in the country that has no productivity growth, but it faces high world real interest rates because other countries are growing quickly, because that is really a bad place to be in the recovery phase. I think that's all the questions. I apologise if I missed anybody.
Excuse me. Thanks very much, Warwick. I think there's a few more around about people are interested to know about the bit about Australia and different state government approaches, and if you had any comment on that one. I think there was a question around that.
Is that in the chat, is it, rather than the Q&A?
Might be at the top here. What about looking at, say, some Australian states and territories?
Yeah,
getting it right?
So I gave a presentation at Brookings to all the senior very senior people back in March, and it was actually early April, about why did Australia get it right? And when you look to see what Australia was doing, there was a couple of things that were really important. One was you had leadership, you had the federal government and you had the state governments, and they formed the national cabinet. And forming the national cabinet meant that all the leaders were on the same page. And as we saw in the bushfires, the state leaders did a great job. The federal leadership was missing in action. So under COVID, they learned from that initial mistake. So you had coordination, you had agreement. So the strategy was bring in the experts, get the expert opinion federally and at the state level, be on the same page, tell the same message. And early on, that's exactly what they did. Put in place a response, have a very clear plan. The Australian government website had some very good information on the disease. They formed various groups of experts to put out on the web and government websites exactly what was going on, what we knew, the information that was coming in from other countries. As the disease started to be under control in Australia and we started to have the debates about opening up, then we started to have fracturing. So we started to have the old politics of left and right started to reappear. And so what we need really is we need unity here. We also need, I think the federal cabinet, if could do it better, I would have put the leader of the opposition on there and several key shadow ministers. Going out of COVID, I think that's still important because the policy frameworks that we need going forward have to be bipartisan. It has to be supported for both sides, and the best way to get ownership is to have the people at the table. So we had a national cabinet with the key players from both sides of the major parties at the table, more likely to get enduring policy reform. But Australia did, I think, got a few things wrong. Big mistakes on cruise ships, big mistakes on quarantine hotels. But I think the characteristics of what you need for success are this: firstly, understanding the problem, believing the experts actually, and there's a range of expert opinion, of course, but some of the people you hear give professing opinion, I would say they're in the tail. So you want to have the core of the distribution. But if you're going to do climate policy, you do it exactly the same way. We learned from this, how do you design a climate policy for Australia, in my view? Same set of issues: risk, uncertainty, facing very large potential economic costs in climate change, potentially very reasonably high economic costs in dealing with it, depending on how you do it. So I think there's a lot of mapping between those two policy questions. But we're lucky, we only have this Australian states and the Fed to deal with. Where the US, you had 50 states and you had a president that was completely not leading. And so you had, and still have, coordination failure, inconsistent messaging, fake news, fake experts. And so I don't know how you deal with that, but Australia managed to survive so far despite being in that world.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had one follow-up question. I guess I'm interested in if you had a thought about what if this goes on for a long time. What does the Australian government have the fiscal capacity to continue these massive injections for 5 years? It could be years down.
Well, I mean, again, that's the I don't know how many $1 trillion, but that's the multiple $1 trillion question. My view is real interest rates are significantly negative. If you allow the unemployment rate to rise to the levels that the modelling suggests it might, the long-term consequences of that for economic activity are really severe. We know that it takes a long time once you end up getting long-term unemployed to reabsorb those people. And so you're better off if you can keep these fiscal packages going. You may want to finance them differently. And I think that's a key question. Should they all be just fiscal on the fiscal budget? Bruce Chapman and myself and others have argued that you could use income contingent loans as a way of financing household support, that you don't pay it back until your incomes are restored, just like a HEX system, or you could have a cash flow dependent loan. I mean, the government guarantees a little bit like this. The government guarantees on loans a little bit like that, in the sense that the banks themselves have a monitoring role and the government has a fiscal exposure. You've got to balance, when you start being creative, you've got to be balancing the risks and the opportunities that people will exploit the system if they can. But you also need to be able to support incomes in the economy, and that's critical. And also the big issue, I think, is the zombie firm issue. I mean, at some point, if this doesn't go away, firstly, the solution I think probably won't be vaccine based, it'll be treatment based. So all the benefits will come in treatment, just like we saw with AIDS, HIV AIDS, and that was really, we learned to live with that. AIDS has never had a vaccine. We changed behavior, we changed treatments. And so I think that's the world in which we most likely will go into. Question is, how well do humans cope with permanent social distancing? I mean, it may well be that we end up with herd immunity, but my guess is, given the scientific evidence on how long antibodies are staying in people's blood, they're declining very quickly, which means that's not good news for a vaccine, because the vaccine is going to have to be continually creating antibodies. But also it's bad news from a herd immunity argument, because these viruses tend to mutate. And so we don't know what it does to the brain. We don't know what it does to people's bodies. So you need to have as many different ideas about how you might intervene from a medical point of view and an economic point of view. The worst thing you can do is to be precise. I know what's going on, and this is what we do no matter what. I think even in the budget, I would have not just had a single projection. I would have said, here's 5 different futures. And the Australian people, that which one of these we're going to go down once things start evolving. And so you can adapt to knowing what our response will be. And that anchors expectations, that builds confidence. To base everything on your forecast in a world of great uncertainty is I don't think, the optimal way of dealing with policy. You have to be honest with people. You have to be clear about what you'll do under different circumstances. And I think we could improve that in many countries, but including Australia.
Okay, thanks so much, Warwick. I think there's still a few questions coming in, but we could probably ask you questions all night. Really, really impressive, and thanks so much. It's been really good to be able to get some insight into all the parameters that are affecting the economy and the choices being made around the world, and it gives all of us economists a bit of a framework to think about these problems as we get asked questions and we redirect them to people who know what they're doing, like yourself. So I'm really happy that you're able to speak to the government and give them this kind of advice to guide Australia. Hopefully they take your advice, but at least they're getting good advice. Whether they act on it properly or not is up to them. But thanks so much for your talk tonight and taking time out for the Economic Society of Australia. And we, everyone, I'm hope everyone's giving an applause, because that was really, really an impressive talk. So thanks again. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Brad. Thanks everyone for your questions, and apologies for, I just noticed there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat room. So I'll make sure I look there next time, as well as in the Q&A. But
yeah, it's hard to learn about all these new technologies, but we've got to get there.
Well, the good news is I've been all over the world several times, out of my bedroom. No more jet lag. I miss the restaurants. I miss the fun that we have when we travel. But you know, it's great. It's good for teaching too. I find teaching on Zoom is actually, on a one-to-one basis with a PhD student, is actually much better, because you can look at what they're doing on their computer, and I think that's really helpful. But anyway, yeah, new technologies are changing rapidly, so we'll wait and see if that productivity boom comes.
Brilliant. Yes, I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Brad.
Thanks, Warwick. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.